Russell Moore has been one of my favorite voices in evangelical Christendom for the past probably decade now. I have thoroughly appreciated his takes on things, even when we theologically don't agree. I've found him to be thoughtful, willing to critique his own, willing to push back, not ascribing to superficialities and general overgeneralizations, except on this. And that's what's been so incredibly disappointing. I was less familiar with Mike Cosper. I was familiar with his Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast. I think that was a phenomenal podcast and a needed message for the church. And I still to this day recommend it. But he was even more one-sided and guilty of oversimplification than Russell Moore. So the two of them sort of steering Christianity Today. As a decades-long reader of Christianity Today, that's been beyond frustrating. It's been heartbreaking. And you, in your chapter, the quote you said, it started on page 387. You talked about the Muniers, and I'll let you tell the viewers who they are. But you said the flagship magazine could have called readers to stand with the Muniers and other peacemakers under attack. Instead, they turned a remarkable family into a curiosity and reinforced the falsehood that Palestinians committed to nonviolence are few, ineffective, and irrelevant. You go on to say on the next page, CT seems reluctant to help us hear from Palestinians on their own terms. They've certainly had the chance. I know Palestinians who offered to share their experiences and perspectives in the pages of CT and have been turned down, as do I. I completely agree, and I thought that was right on. So can you unpack that a little bit for viewers of the channel who have not seen or didn't read that issue or didn't listen to Mike Cosper's podcast? Just give a nutshell version of what you're addressing in this chapter.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, I want to start too by saying I love CT for many reasons. I grew up around CT. CT, founded by Billy Graham in the 50s, has kind of always been, at least in the frame of reference of my community, seen as a centrist kind of voice, flagship, as we've said, institution within evangelicalism. Not kind of like hard right, like some publications you could imagine, or more progressive, like a Sojourner's magazine. Right. They've kind of fit that middle ground, and I've really appreciated some of their language over the years of being committed to beautiful orthodoxy and to the global kingdom of God. More recently is kind of the language they're using right now. And when they came out strongly and boldly against the really problematic alliance between evangelicalism and MAGA, that made my heart sing. I was like, oh, someone here is a flagship institution that's affirming something that I've been feeling deeply myself, and I resubscribed, and I've been a subscriber since then. So CT, this is coming from a subscriber who has a deep affection for the institution and affirms so much of what you do. In a nutshell, CT kind of turns off its journalism. Now, I want to actually clarify. My main critique is of CT's editorial voice. Okay. There are journalists that I know who work for CT journalists who see things far more clearly, actually, and who I think have a greater hold on the factual basis of what's happening on the ground because they actually live there or have lived there. CT has journalists on the ground or who have lived on the ground, as opposed to the editorial voice and the editors who kind of make final decisions about whether a story will run or not and how will the story be framed and pitched to the readers. Yeah. And so even articles that I came across that are written by people who I really know to kind of have their heads screwed on straight on this, take on, by the time of publication, they take on a valence that sounds to me more like Mike Cosper than what I know of that journalist,
Yeah.
or like the editorial team. So, so with that kind of caveat, what I find is that Christianity today has a blind spot for Israeli brutality and criminality. As soon as Palestinian suffering in a story starts tracing back to Israeli action or Israeli blameworthiness, the story won't run.
Yeah.
So there are stories about Palestinian suffering. A few. They're not a lot, but a handful. And in every case, those stories are always framed with reference to, that suffering results because of if it's about Palestinian Christians, that suffering stems from persecution by their Muslim neighbors.
Right.
Or if it's about Palestinians in general, that suffering stems from Hamas. Never, ever, ever. There is no space based on what actually is in black and white in the pages of CT for recognizing or wrestling with Israeli agency in creating that suffering. So there's a kind of blindness there. I also do find that there are factual problems with much of what they say. I didn't get too much into that in the chapter, but just to cite one recent example, in the Bulletin, which is CT's flagship podcast, just a few weeks ago on August 29th, that Bulletin, Russell Moore, Mike Cosper, and their producer, Ms. Mall, I don't remember her first name, but Ms. Mall, are talking about the recent Israeli strike against Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis. I don't know if you remember this, but it was in the news because it was a double tap attack where Israel bombed shelled tank shell, guided tank shell, targeted, hit Nasser Hospital. And then 10 minutes later, they hit it again after the journalists and first responders arrived. And as far as I can tell, one person died with that first strike, and then another 21 died with the second strike, because that's what's so problematic about a double tap attack. As they were discussing this, they were using it as an example of what they were claiming was, a proclivity in the press to get it wrong when it comes to Israel, and that Israel has this unique problem that they face with international sentiment because, the first thing after an attack like this is everyone across the world sees the horrific footage and makes up their mind, Israel bad. And then they have their slow-moving bureaucracy and finally kind of explain themselves in the press 24 or 48 hours later. But by then, everyone's kind of moved on and they've made up their minds. So they were kind of like complaining that that's how it works, and that's what happened with Nasser Hospital. And in that context, Mike said that official statement that came later from the Israeli government, that they claimed, that the Israeli government claimed, number one, that they struck a camera position, surveillance position of Hamas. And number two, that among the casualties were two militants who were wearing press vests. Cosper claimed those two things as matters of fact and presented them to his listeners as, oh, this is what happened.
Right.
Here is the authoritative line on what happened. But the problem is those are both false. So Israel did claim that the camera position was connected to Hamas, but in the days since then, it's become clear that there's no evidence for that, and that camera person was a journalist working for Reuters. And then relative to the second claim, that Israel claimed that there were two press vest wearing militants, they didn't actually claim that at all. So there are some just plain fact problems that this stems back in my mind to what we were talking about earlier about holding to a mythology makes for poor journalism.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that unfortunately that has to be said in a lot of, especially the podcasts and the articles that emerged from the editorial level of CT over the last 2 years.
That story, which you helpfully lay out, Ben, makes you have to ask the question, what would Israel have to do for some of these folk to actually, flip, or at least, register profound concern, charge Israel with offense. It's looking like Israel can do almost anything, or even anything, and those partisans would continue to subscribe to the myth, which reminds us all of how difficult it is to change our minds on any topic. We are determined to reinforce and defend positions of our own when they look less and less plausible. In fact, maybe that undermining of our position makes us more prone to defend what we've held. Anyway, this is a great example of that. When I listen to people like a Mike Cosper, and I too really appreciated the Mars Hill piece. That's where I first encountered him. And so I thought, well, he certainly sounds like he knows what he's talking about. He's done his homework, But I didn't, I knew a little bit about Mars Hill, but I wasn't fact checking anything that he was saying. And I just basically took it as sound, responsible journalism. Then when I hear him talk about something I actually know something about, well, then for me, his judgment and credibility is suspect across the board. Like, I no longer am willing to give him a pass simply because when you step into my world, the world I've been studying for the last 20 years, and you talk the way you talk, your judgment, is problematic. So where else has your judgment been problematic? It's too bad, because that undermines his credibility in other topics as well. Of course, this one, wins the prize as being the most horrific and deadly of all that he's covered.
Yeah. Well, Ben, you said in talking about that podcast series that he did, you made a point to say Mike Cosper, the host's warm approach to Israeli guests contrasted with his adversarial tone toward Palestinians, just showcases his bias. Cosper perpetuates myths that portray Israel as morally pure. By presenting Palestinians as a monolithic group associated with radicalism, and by filtering their perspectives through Israeli sources, the podcast traffics in stereotypes. And I could not agree more. This is why, Disciple Dojo a couple of years ago, we took a small group to Christ at the Checkpoint, and then spent the week after that, or a few days after that, going and on the Israeli side and being among Israelis, and so that people in the group could get both sides, for no other reason than for my goal was to show those people that went on the trip what you're reading and hearing in Christian media, in mainstream American media, is so vastly different from the reality on the ground, and nowhere more so than how it portrays Palestinians and dehumanizes Palestinians by immediately equating them with terrorism and radicals. And it's just so unfortunate. And like you said, Bruce, it really does. It taints. Now, when anybody reads, certainly when I read something from CT, I'm now just in the back of my head like, all right, how much of this is actually true? Because I know you got that wrong. What else have you? Just like you said, it's just so unfortunate. I hate it. I hate it as a friend of Christianity today. It's just, it's a needed chapter. It was such a needed chapter.
Yeah, that podcast is. So it's called Promised Land. 6 episodes, written and directed by Mike Cosper. CT sent him to Israel after October 7th in the months following. And so he went, he interviewed people, he collected sound clips. It's actually very highly and beautifully produced.
Very well done. Yeah.
In the same way that Mars Hill was. Like, they are extremely good at their craft.
Yeah.
You know, you hear the texture of like a door open, the sound of a door opening, or you know, rocket sirens in the distance, or whatever. So it's kind of beautiful to listen to if you know, for those of us who kind of know how problematic it is. It's also at the same time a frustrating experience, of course. But one of the issues that I had with that podcast was that he claims that he wanted to hear both sides.
Yeah.
So he spends time with Palestinians and he spends time with Israelis. But the differential treatment between those two that comes through really clearly in the podcast is it just kind of screams bias to me. You know, if everything from like out of the 6 episodes, only one of them is about Palestinian perspectives, and every single Palestinian that he interviews, those are all in that one episode. So they're all squeezed in there. The other 5 episodes are all Israeli perspectives and interview subjects. And if you, wherever, because they're talking regularly about the Palestinians through all of these episodes. So in the other 5 episodes, if someone is talking about the Palestinians, it's not a Palestinian talking about Palestinians. It's Mike Cosper talking about them. It's Israeli military people talking about them. It's Israeli intellectuals. It's Zionists. It's settlers characterizing Palestinians for us, the listeners, which is just really problematic and is at odds with his stated purpose of wanting to understand both sides.
Yeah.
And it stems back to what I would see as kind of like, broadly speaking, not just CT, but in a lot of American Christian spaces, an unwillingness to let Palestinians testify on their own terms. Here we're talking about them. The pages of CT are like, there's a lot in there about Palestinians, and almost in every case, it's not the Palestinians talking.
Yeah.
So
it's just disingenuous. At the end of the day, it's just disingenuous to say we're going to present both sides and give a completely steered and manufactured and artificial view. I mean, it's frustrating. It's just super frustrating primarily because I know so many evangelical Palestinian Christians whose voices we need to be magnifying.
Yeah.
And the evangelical flagship publication in the world needs to be magnifying its own, and instead it's magnifying Israeli political talking points. And Christians.